Welcome to the Iowa Secondary Transition Learning Community. Today's webinar is on the Iowa Model of Transition Assessment. Today's presenters are Ann Lupkus from Central Rivers AEA and Michelle Ryan from Great Prairie AEA. The materials that you will need to access for today's webinar are a hard copy of the Living Learning Working Chart, the Explore worksheet, and the SDI framework. Let's begin by talking about the purpose of assessment. Transition assessment is an ongoing process of collecting information on a student's strengths, needs, preferences, and interests as they relate to the demands of current and future living, learning, and working environments. This process should begin in middle school and continue until the student graduates or exits high school. Information from this process should be used to drive the IEP and transition planning process and to develop the summary of performance document detailing the student's academic and functional performance and post-secondary goals. Age-appropriate transition assessments refer to a collection of data on the student's needs, preferences, and interests. Transition assessments should be completed each year, and the information can be used in the transition IEP. Transition assessments can cover many areas, including employment, self-determination and self-advocacy, independent living, and study skills. Nice picture.
Nice picture. It's not what we want, but it's a nice picture. All right, so can I leave us right there?
Hello, welcome to the Iowa Secondary Transition Learning Community. Today's webinar is on the Iowa Model of Transition Assessment. The presenters for today are Ann Lupkus of Central Rivers AEA and Michelle Ryan from Great Prairie AEA. Materials that you will need for today's webinar include the Living Learning Working Chart, the Explore worksheet, and the SDI framework. Let's begin by talking about the purpose of assessment. Transition assessment is an ongoing process of collecting information on a student's strengths, needs, preferences, and interests as they relate to the demands of current and future living, learning, and working environments. This process should begin in middle school and continue until the student graduates or exits high school. Information from this process should be used to drive the IEP and transition planning process and to develop the summary of performance document detailing the student's academic and functional performance and post-secondary goals. Age-appropriate transition assessments refer to the collection of data on a student's needs, preferences, and interests. Transition assessments should be completed each year, and the information can be used in the transition IEP. Transition assessments can cover many areas, including employment, self-determination and self-advocacy, independent living, and study skills.
Our learning outcomes for today's session is focused on the purpose of transition assessment, as well as the Iowa process framework we encourage teams to use, which is called the Iowa Model of Transition Assessment. Throughout our learning today, you'll be given time to explore and resources to build your toolbox for transition-related materials. Transition assessment is required for all students, beginning at least by the time the student turns 14 and continues until the student graduates or ages out at 21. While assessments are required, the purpose of gathering assessment information is to answer questions. The questions we have regarding to living, learning, and working in the future settings should determine the sources and methods we use. Let's briefly review the definition of transition assessment. The definition gives us guidance on the process, what needs to be documented as a product, and who should be involved. We are gathering information related to that student's interests, preferences, strengths, and determine needs for their post-secondary expectations. It tells us that we begin at least by the time they're 14, and we continue until they graduate or age out. So it's not once and we're done, but an ongoing process. And within that, it tells us how to do it, to provide data to help us plan and make decisions for post-secondary expectations. And again, input comes from the student, family, and all school personnel or any other relevant stakeholders, which comprises the IEP team. Here we have an example of the state's framework for specially designed instruction. And within that framework, you'll see there is diagnose, design, deliver, and engagement. And when we look at the Iowa Model for Transition Assessment and SDI, they share many of the same components. Today, we're going to spend most of our time talking about that diagnose for instructional design based upon riot and skill and the assessment process.
The Iowa Model for Transition Assessment is Iowa's response to Indicator B13. It is the framework for how to effectively put the requirements into action. The Iowa Model of Transition Assessment relates to living, learning, and working. It emphasizes a student's strengths and abilities. It gathers appropriate, useful information, including student interests, preferences, and needs. And it provides data for decision making. So if you would look at your living, learning, and working chart, this document was created and shared by Central Rivers AEA and can be used to help the IEP team engage in the transition process. Documentation on this chart can assist the team in completing the IEP process and document. So I'm going to walk you through the LLW chart. The purpose of it is to identify realistic post-secondary expectations, including the level of independence and location. Identify the essential skills needed in the post-secondary setting. Assess and document the student's current skills in relation to the skills needed in the future setting. To determine whether there is a gap or a match between current and future skills for the post-secondary expectation. To determine services, supports, activities, and linkages the student will need to be prepared for their post-secondary expectations. And then to monitor the progress of each service or support. Here are the strengths, interests, and preferences on our case study student named Emily. Looking at the strengths, interests, and preferences for Emily, Would this be enough to guide your next steps in developing the post-secondary expectations for living, learning, and working? If not, what else do you need, and where would you go to gather the needed information? Let's take a look at post-secondary expectations. The intent of transition planning is to plan for a student's living, learning, and working after high school based on assessments and written as outcome statements on the IEP. If the student is unable to identify the post-secondary expectations in living, learning, and working, the IEP team needs to work with the student to look at options available and provide opportunity to investigate options. For a very young student, this would be the focus of the IEP. It'd be to do career exploration and talk about living and learning environments to support their career choice. So back to our case study of Emily. Here are the post-secondary expectations that Emily's team came up with for living based on her strengths, interests, and preferences. They said that Emily would live on her own or with a roommate. Then her post-secondary expectation for learning based on her strengths, interests, and preferences would be that she would attend a community college in the area of culinary arts. And then for working, she was going to be employed as a chef. Emily has shared with her IEP team her post-secondary expectations for living, learning, and working. The first step in determining alignment is to see if the post-secondary expectations are supported by what we know from the strengths, interests, and preferences. Do we have alignment? Sometimes you will have a student that has no idea what they would like to do for the post-secondary expectation of working. You may need to discuss with that student different job possibilities, where they would like to live, and what do they expect to do for learning, and then to see if those all align. If they're having difficulty coming up with career options, the Central Rivers website, the Great Prairie website, and the Prairie Lakes website, Moving Students Forward, has some resources. We will explore those later in this webinar. Right now, we have 4 websites that you can see on the screen that are live sites: Future Ready Iowa, My Next Move, Career One Stop, and ONET. At this time, you will be given an opportunity to explore each of those sites and look for key points that you would like to be able to take back to your colleagues or teachers. When you are finished with your exploration, you may return to the presentation and continue. So pause this presentation at this time.
The next step in the Iowa Transition Assessment Model is looking at those essential post-secondary skills that any individual would need to move on to post-secondary living, learning, and working. It's important to know those expectations that are needed after high school in order to assess the student's current skills to see if there's a match or a gap and what skills need to be taught. When we're looking at resources to determine future skills for living, learning, and working, we've pulled together some resources. It's not an exhaustive list, but it is something that can spark conversation. We must know what Emily can or cannot do, but we also need to know what skills are needed in each of those post-secondary environments for Emily to be able to be successful. We ask you to look at this list of resources, think about ones that you may have used in the past, or if you're not familiar with any of these, go and explore at a different time, but also think about resources you use in each of these areas and maybe add it to your list. Michelle's going to talk just a little bit about how you can use a college website to walk through and look at expectations for the next setting.
Sometimes we have students who are not really for sure if the next learning setting is right for them or not, and the program of study that they have chosen, if it is the right fit for them. So you could take them to a college website and you can walk them through the requirements needed for whichever the career field that was their choice that they wanted to go into. What you would do is you would, if I was choosing the Southeastern Community College website, I would click on the Academics tab, then I'd go down to the Catalog of Programs and Degrees, and I would choose a program of interest for the student. We have students that are interested in automotive technology, so that is the one that I will use my example for today. I would walk them through that program of study for automotive technology, and I would have stopping points throughout that I would stop and ask them, were they still on board? Was this what they thought it was? Any of those questions that would help answer for them, yes, I'm still on board. This is what I believe I would like to do in the next setting, or no, let's go back and explore some other options.
So as we go back to our case study and think about Emily, again, we're thinking about what are the essential post-secondary skills that any individual would need in that setting of living, learning, and working. So Emily had said she wanted to live independently or with a roommate. So as a team, you'd want to think about what are the essential skills that anyone would need to live independently or with a roommate. And the team for Emily thought that it was important to get along with others, be able to manage money, care for themselves, shop and cook, clean and maintain their personal space, find and secure housing, and find transportation. And there may be other essential skills to live independently that your team might identify, but that, again, is setting those expectations for the future. Because Emily had identified she wanted to go to post-secondary community college, the team looked at what are some essential skills that any student would need to be able to go to community college. And of course, they identified meeting the requirements for acceptance into a program of study, having the appropriate executive functioning skills to pass classes, and the appropriate reading and math skills to participate in the program of study. And lastly, thinking about what kind of skills would be needed in a restaurant situation, since Emily had identified that she wanted to be a chef. So the team pulled together and thought that she would need some physical stamina, be able to do multi-step directions, transition from task to task, be able to problem solve, accept correction, have fine motor skills, and apply some math skills.
Now let's begin looking at Emily's current skills. So we know that the needed skills are based on the expectation, but we also need to consider what skills the student currently has in order to help identify any gap. What classes should the student be taking? Where can those classes take place? Gen Ed, special education. Is specially designed instruction needed? What activities could the student participate in? Depending on parent involvement and their skill level, what can the parents help with at home? And what resources are available in the community? So we know that Emily is a sophomore, and this is what her team found out through the assessment process of what her skills were in the area of living. She can cook from a recipe. She has a savings account but has not been responsible for bills. She grooms independently but hasn't set up routine appointments. And she depends on her parent to wake her up in the morning, and she has a driver's license. For learning, her current skills are: she is working on 5th grade Iowa Core math standards. She reads and comprehends at the 6th grade level. She struggles with time management, and she is responsible to turn in work. And then her current level of skills in the area of working are: she has babysitting experience. She has never applied for a job outside the home. She volunteers serving meals at church. She's worked in the school concession stand, making popcorn and assembling sandwiches. So now we're going to do another activity where you will explore living, learning, and working assessments and share out one new learning. You can either look at the Central Rivers Area Education Agency, the Prairie Lakes Moving Students Forward, or Great Prairie Area Education Agency. There's also some national sites over there that you can also go in and look at: Zaro Center, Intact, and Transition Coalition. When you are finished exploring, please return to this presentation and continue. But for right now, you may pause and explore those sites and look for new assessments or resources.
As you explored those different websites, hopefully you found some resources that you can apply to your own practice or share with others. And the idea there was to have you look at assessments that would be appropriate to help identify the match or a gap between the skills needed in the future and the skills that a student currently has, which is what we were looking at when we looked at Emily. What skills did she need in the future living, learning, and working, and what skills does she currently have in the areas of living, learning, and working to determine what kinds of programming that we need to do. We've walked through the front part of the living, learning, working worksheet by identifying post-secondary expectations, looking at those expectations, the skills needed in those areas, and Emily's current skills. And now at the bottom, there's a question: is it a match or is it a gap? If it's a match, there aren't any services needed. But if there's a gap, then the IEP team needs to determine how they're going to identify those priority and essential skills and then address them. So what does the plan for Emily look like? We know that she's a sophomore, so will she take classes in Gen Ed? Are there gaps that are so great that she needs specially designed instruction? Are there activities that she could participate in to practice her skills? What are we going to address any deficits? How is that going to happen? If the gap is so big, what do we need to prioritize to address first? And then what kinds of supports can we do to help her with her living? Are there things that she can do at home? So the backside of that Living, Learning, Working worksheet would have your course of study, any type of goal that you would want to write for specially designed instruction, and then identifying activities, services, and supports. This brings us to the end of our webinar today. We'd like you to think about application to the information that you have received. So think about one of these 3 questions. How will you teach someone about the Iowa Transition Assessment Model process? What did you learn today that you'll be able to use with teachers or in your own practice? And in what ways will you apply the skills you gained in the activities today? Other webinars in this series include what is secondary transition, planning for the next setting, living and working, and planning for the next setting, post-secondary training and education. Thank you for participating in this webinar series.